Mistakes happen, even to the best, I would say. And it can always occur that one writes an invoice incorrectly. This can indeed have consequences, both for the issuer of the invoice, meaning the one who sends the invoice, as well as for the recipient of the invoice, and it can become quite costly. The biggest point of contention is, in most cases, always the value-added tax, as the invoicing regulations, that is, what should be included on an invoice, are outlined in the Value-Added Tax Act. In other words, it typically usually revolves around who actually pays how much value-added tax. And to perhaps start with what actually constitutes a false invoice, well, it is always an invoice where something is incorrect regarding the mandatory information in an invoice. Simple typographical errors, such as letter transpositions and so on, where the actual meaning and purpose are still evident, are not really relevant for tax purposes. However, whenever an invoice number is incorrect, a date is wrong, a company name is incorrect, the product description is wrong, or the tax rate is incorrect, these issues can unfortunately have tax consequences and can become quite expensive. Of course, the question arises, what actually needs to be included on such an invoice? I have already created an in-depth video on this topic, so I don't want to cover it in full detail in this video. That means if you are not sure what should be included on your invoice, make sure to watch the video that I have linked for you in the top right corner. But also take a look at the video description below, as I have linked a PDF with a checklist of what should be included on such an invoice for your convenience. Feel free to use this checklist to review incoming invoices that you receive, as well as to carefully and comprehensively check your own before they are sent out. In preparation for this video, I took a look at the invoices that our clients actually received to get an overview. I noticed 5 mistakes that are quite common. The first mistake is actually that the name of the invoice recipient is misspelled, meaning the company name. You must always specify the exact company name. There is a difference, for example, between issuing an invoice to Contest Ltd or writing an invoice to Contest Tax Consulting Ltd. These are 2 different companies, and it must be very clear to whom you have provided your services. What I also see quite often is actually with sole proprietorships, particularly those that are not registered in the commercial register. Most sole proprietorships do not have a fictitious name, which means they are not allowed to, for example. They are not called Contest, but rather they are always named after the self-employed person's actual name. So if I become self-employed and do not register in the commercial register, my company name will always be Melchior Neumann. And that is important. It must be stated on the invoice. You cannot simply write Contest as the invoice recipient if I have established myself as a sole proprietor. A second mistake that I see relatively often is that your invoice needs a sequential invoice number, meaning both the invoice you issue and the one you receive, because the tax office must be able to trace that they have seen every invoice and that you haven't just slipped a few invoices past the tax authorities. Continuing does not mean that you have to start with 1 and then do 2, 3, 4, 5 and so on, but rather you need a system that clearly shows that you have indeed submitted all invoices, for example, during a tax audit. A third error that I also see relatively often, which you should definitely avoid, is calculation errors throughout the entire invoice calculation. This means that if you have different items, they are somehow added incorrectly. Sometimes the tax calculation is not entirely correct. You should always first have the total net price broken down by tax rates, then add the tax amount, and then you have the gross amount. It is very important that you do it this way and do not calculate back and forth in a strange manner. This must be really clear and understandable, as mistakes happen quite frequently. A fourth error that I have also seen relatively often is 2001-5, simply the wrong tax rate. This means that 0% is often misbilled for value-added tax when 19% was correct, or 19% is billed when 7% was correct, and so on. This is always incredibly frustrating because it always leads to situations where input tax cannot be claimed, yet value-added tax still has to be paid. This means that there is always a financial disadvantage for one of the parties involved. And fifthly, another mistake that I have seen often is that there is simply no explanation as to why you are not showing any value-added tax. In many cases, correct if you don't show any value-added tax, but you need some justification, for example, a reference to the small business regulation. Perhaps your revenue is a reverse charge revenue, so you do not show any VAT. So your invoice needs to include a note about the reverse charge procedure, otherwise the invoice is not correct. But what do you do if you now realize I have received an incorrect invoice, or oh shit, I have sent an incorrect invoice? It's quite simple. Then you correct this invoice and you actually have a personal interest in doing so. Why should you do this? Firstly, as the invoicer, you have a legal obligation to issue a proper invoice. Secondly, as the invoice recipient, you also have a strong interest because only then can you ensure that you can actually account for the costs in your bookkeeping and have an input tax deduction. There are 2 ways you can correct an invoice. The first method is admittedly, in my opinion, the better one. You simply create a credit note. This means you cancel the document, the invoice that you issued earlier. In other words, you effectively set it to 0 and then just issue a correct invoice. This credit note is often colloquially referred to as a credit. To be precise, however, it is not a credit, but a credit note. However, what you can also do if, for example, you have issued an incorrect invoice, is to issue a second correction invoice, which effectively cancels out the error. Then you have the original incorrect invoice plus the correction. This then constitutes a correct invoice. That is also possible. This invoice correction is particularly useful if you have not yet sent your invoice. So that means if the invoice is still in your system, for example, and you made a mistake, clicked save, and then realize, oh shoot, there is an error, then you can simply correct the invoice and send it out. Alternatively, you can create a second document that includes the missing invoice details. An invoice does not necessarily have to be a single document. An invoice can also consist of multiple documents. It is important to clarify that they belong together. This means that it would generally be possible, but I can only strongly recommend it if you have not yet sent out the invoice and it is not with the customer. This also means that this is not really an option for incoming invoices. However, if the incorrect invoice is already in circulation, the entire correction process is a bit more complicated, but if you proceed systematically, it is actually very clear. In the end, you should have a total of 3 documents. Firstly, there is the incorrect invoice that needs to be corrected. Then, a separate credit note is created, which effectively eliminates the previous invoice, sets it to 0, and balances it out. It should also have its own specific and unique invoice number. And thirdly, the correct invoice, meaning the corrected proper invoice, for the total amount with all details. Ideally, the credit note should refer to the original incorrect invoice, and the correct invoice should ideally reference both the credit note and the original incorrect invoice. This is simply to ensure that it is clear that this is a business transaction. Now let's imagine how this works in practice. You receive an incorrect invoice from one of your service providers. You write that the invoice is incorrect and you need a corrected invoice. Then you simply receive a new invoice, in the worst case under the same invoice number. Later it becomes unclear which one was the original and which one was correct. It becomes quite difficult to determine which invoices actually need to be paid. Always remember, you must keep your documents for 10 years. This means you need to be able to trace back what exactly happened even after 8 years. And also in the other direction, if you simply issue 2 invoices under the same invoice number without a credit note, you may also have to pay tax on both. If the tax office sees 2 invoices, then you must tax both. So it is very important to proceed systematically. An incorrect invoice automatically and immediately results in a credit note with its own unique invoice number and a correct invoice. If you listen to all of this now, you might be wondering, why should I actually do this? So, what is really at stake? How much of a fine is there for an incorrect invoice? Admittedly, not particularly much, indeed. The fine for issued invoices is always at the discretion of the caseworker and can amount to up to approximately $5,000. But that is not the point at all. Because the much more serious issue is other things. For example, if you incorrectly report value-added tax, you still have to pay the incorrectly reported value-added tax to the tax office. But the invoice recipient, or if you are a customer and receive an invoice that is incorrect, cannot claim an input tax deduction. And it does not matter what is wrong with that invoice, you cannot claim an input tax deduction from an incorrect invoice. Otherwise, you have an invoice where the invoice numbers somehow jump and have gaps. Then the tax office can, for example, go in during the business audit and say, we don't believe you have presented all the invoices to us because there are significant gaps, and we estimate that there is revenue in between that you are not showing us, so we estimate how much revenue you actually made there. And if they now, for example, if it turns out that you somehow generated revenue with these supposedly missing invoices, you will have to pay the taxes retroactively. Otherwise, you write an invoice without value-added tax because you forget to include the note about the small business regulation. Yes, the tax office should know you are a small business owner and so do not show any sales tax on the invoice. This means that, in the worst case, the tax office will assume that this is a fully taxable sale and you must remit 19% on it. This means you will have to subsequently remit 19% on all your sales. And this is the significant financial damage that can occur, which can quickly become very, very high. That is why I urge you to take this process of invoice correction extremely seriously. The financial damage that can arise from this can truly be existentially threatening. I hope I haven't scared you too much with this video. Honestly, correcting and checking invoices is such an annoying everyday problem, but it is not particularly difficult. However, I urgently want to point out that this is really very important, as the financial damage can indeed be existentially threatening and has already cost some self-employed individuals their independence. Or take a look at one of our other videos. For example, this one.